Hello and welcome to this complimentary webinar from Raise the Bar. My name is Hayley Barnard and I'm going to be leading you through this session today, which is entitled, Why Can't Everyone Be More Like Me? Moving from unconscious bias to inclusive leadership. So this is going to be a very top line, basic introduction to these topics of diversity and inclusion and unconscious bias. Couple of housekeeping items just while people are connecting. I'm going to be talking for about 30-35 minutes, and then there's going to be time for questions, 10-15 minutes at the end. If you want to ask a question, all you need to do is click on the little Q&A icon on the left-hand side of your screen, and then on the other side, on the right-hand side, you should see a box come up. You can type your questions in there, and I'll be able to see them at the end of my 30-35 minutes talking, and I'll endeavour to answer as many of them as I can. Okay, let's get started. And let me start with this. Your brain is amazing. You've been looking at me for no more than a minute, and already you know quite a lot about me. So you know that I'm British, white woman. You probably have an idea about my socioeconomic background, an idea about how educated I am. What about my marital status or my religion? What about what newspaper I read or what sort of car I drive? I bet you could make an educated guess if you had to, couldn't you? Psychologists at Princetown University have proved that it takes a tenth of a second, the blink of an eye, to form an opinion of someone, and longer exposure doesn't necessarily change the way that we view them. And rightly or wrongly, something called unconscious bias comes into play when we form those opinions. So that's why I want to explore a little bit of this topic today. Now I'm going to share my screen with you, which might just take a second, so that you can see some slides and I can go through some basic definitions. Now, if during the process of doing this you find I become out of sync, then don't worry about that. You can just press the refresh button and it will automatically bring you back, hopefully in sync, and it won't throw you out, so don't worry. You'll still be in the webinar and it will just come back to the right place. So let's start with a definition of bias. So in very simple terms, bias is an inflexible belief, and they can be both positive beliefs and negative beliefs about a particular category of people. You see, we instinctively assume things about people based on kind of common cultural stereotypes rather than on thoughtful judgment. So what do I mean by categories? Well, I mean these sorts of things. Let me make sure this is on full screen because I don't think it is. There we go. Skin tone, age, gender, religion. And whilst we may be aware of some of our biases, there's a growing body of research that shows that we also harbour powerful unconscious or hidden biases. But let me be clear though, right from the start, I just want to stress that unconscious bias is not the same as conscious discrimination, plenty of which we're sadly seeing in this country at the moment. So I'm not saying that we're all closet sexists or racists. There's absolutely no blame here. It's part of our normal brain functioning. It's evolved over millennia, and I'll explain a little bit more about the science and the background to it in a little while. But it's unconscious bias that makes us have these kind of blind spots or mind bugs, if you like, in our thinking. Let me try to illustrate this for you. You see, if I say to you, oh, my secretary will, she'll pop that in the post to you, your brain automatically sees a secretary as female. Having a woman come into your mind is a very hard thing to overcome. It's just natural the way we see things. So maybe, you know, you automatically, your mind's eye jump to someone like this rather than someone like this. Let's try it with a few others. What about a barrister? What comes to mind? Someone like this or like this? A surgeon, are they like this or like this? Or if we were honest, because we unfortunately tend to judge women a little bit more harshly than we do men, We like younger women. We prefer them when they're wearing makeup and smiling. Would you be happier if the doctor looked like this? And this one, well, this just messes with our head. You see, if you only came across the guy in the red t-shirt, you'd probably feel that your life was threatened. Whereas the other guy, well, he can save your life. So there's a really big distinction there, just created by a few tattoos. But it's not just these kind of very specific job titles, you know, barrister, doctor. We do the same thing with really general jobs. And even a senior manager, we have an image in our mind's eye of what a senior manager looks like. Maybe it's someone like this rather than someone like this, the 5th highest paid CEO in the country, or someone like this. So the question isn't, are we biased? The question is, which biases are mine? Which biases are ours? Because once we can start to identify them, we can start to work to mitigate the impact that they have on us as leaders. So let me come out of this screen again and back onto the camera, and let's see how right you were about your first impressions of me. So I am indeed a woman, have been all my life, and I'm 40 years old, married to Lee, got 2 children. I am educated to both postgraduate level. I'm a Christian. I think my parents would have been described as probably financially successful, working class. So, but successful enough to put their 4 children through private school and university. What else can I tell you about myself? Oh yes, so I read the Times only on the weekend. I rely on Twitter the rest of the week for news, and I drive a Volvo Estate with a Labrador dog and some Hunter Wellies in the boot. You see, I couldn't be any more white or any more middle class if I tried. And the thing is, some of you are thinking, she's my sort of person. I could get along with her, you know, I'd quite like to have her around for dinner. And there are others of you who are thinking the complete opposite. And that's okay, because that's just the way we are as humans. That's the sort of assumptions that we automatically draw about people. But I'd like you to try and get a feel for that sense. You know, I'd like you to learn to identify those sorts of feelings when they crop up, because learning to identify with those feelings, those are the sort of things that can help us to become more inclusive leaders. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever been on a training course with a colleague, or you've worked on a project closely together, and as a result of that, you've got to know them a lot better than you did previously, and maybe your opinion of them started to change. Well, there's lots of things about me you definitely couldn't know just from looking at me. So, for example, and actually these are the reasons, some of the reasons that I'm really passionate about this subject of diversity and inclusion. So let me tell you a bit more about me. I'm adopted, along with my identical twin sister, and we were, I think our birth mother would have been about 15 when she conceived. So we adopted, born in Devon, into a lovely Welsh family, and I've always been fascinated by religion, had really big interest in religion all my life. So I went to university, and my first degree was to study religious studies. I specialised in Islam. Then somehow along the way ended up married to a vicar or Baptist minister, not quite sure how that happened. Actually, he's quite buff, like, is that the right word? You know, he's muscly, good looking, and the funny thing is he doesn't have to wear a dog collar very often, which is just as well, because whenever he puts his dog collar on, he looks a little bit like a stripper gram going off to take a funeral, which is never a good look. Anyway, I digress, because we've got 2 children, and they both have a disability. Not what I expected when I was pregnant at all. Huge, you know, surprise. And what else can I tell you? Oh, well, my adoptive parents, they had 2 children of their own, and one of my brothers, Matt, he's gay and very exciting. He's getting married to his long-term partner this summer. Off to buy my wedding hat just after this webinar. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is I would never consciously discriminate against someone on the basis of their religion, their disability, their sexuality. But I have come to see that I have my own internal lenses, if you like, through which I view both other people and myself. And that affects the way I behave towards people. So let me put my screen back on to illustrate this. See, I've come to realize that that's the wrong one. I've come to realize that I am positively biased towards people who have proper sized dogs, like me. It's a little bit annoying. It keeps going back to the beginning. Let me come to this slide. Sorry about this. There we go. I'm positively biased towards people who have proper sized dogs and not people like this. They are not my type of people. Okay, so this is what we're going to do in the remaining time. We're going to look at what's the difference between inclusion and diversity. And then I'm going to explore a little bit more about what is unconscious bias. In particular, what does that look like in the workplace? And also for those who like the science behind things, and in order to help them understand it, I'll go through a little bit of the very basics of the brain science of unconscious bias. Then I want to do some really practical tips for how you can catch yourself being unconsciously biased, because once we become conscious, that's when we can do something about it. And then right at the end, I'm going to do the #1 golden rule that will enable you and your organizations to become more inclusive. Then after that, we'll go on with the Q&A. So let's start with this, that diversity, well, that's about the people, isn't it? It's about the whole richness and human difference. So it can mean the things that we probably come to mind, like race and gender and ethnicity and language, but it also means things like our learning styles, our personalities, our life experiences. In fact, it's actually all the same things that I mentioned on the category slide, the things that we often use to unconsciously judge people and make assumptions about them. And in many ways, it's these cognitive differences that all people have, that all employees have, is where organizations should seek the greatest leverage via the lenses we see complex issues through the knowledge, through the know-how of all the different people in the organization. So by diversity in an organizational sense, we should not just be concerned with minorities, such as, gender or ethnic minorities. I think diversity, we need to look at it in on a much wider scale. You see, I believe the successful organizations of the future will be those that master inclusion of diversity. So what is inclusion? Well, inclusion is about fostering an environment through the structure, the culture, and a mindset that allows people to come to work and say, yeah, I fit in here and I'm valued. And because of that, I can contribute to the fullest. So inclusion means everyone can go to work and be their true self, their full self, because research shows that people perform at their best when they're able to come to work and they don't have to pretend to be something they're not. So we usually talk about diversity in terms of things like skin color, gender and disability or age, but actually inclusion is about ensuring that diversity of knowledge, perspective and information is sought and applied in the way we do business, in the way we make decisions, in the tasks and how we complete tasks. I love this quote from Verna Myers. She says, diversity is being invited to the party, but inclusion is being asked to dance. And I've seen plenty of organizations that are really diverse, but it doesn't mean that they're inclusive places to work. Or to put it another way, diversity is a reality, but inclusion is a choice. And frankly, not only is there an ethical responsibility, but we have a legal responsibility. I'm sure you're all aware that the Equality Act 2010 outlaws discrimination on the grounds of any of these things listed here. An unconscious bias, I believe, is one of the major contributing factors to the lack of diversity in senior management today. Understanding the science behind how we think and how those we lead think is the starting point for inclusive leadership, I think. Perhaps you're wondering, why am I suddenly hearing all this stuff about unconscious bias? I don't ever remember hearing about it before. And the reality is it is actually quite new. It's really down to enhancements in our ability to scan the brain through MRI, that we've been able to have a much better understanding of the way the brain works. So when we make decisions, we can see which bits are lighting up, which bits of the brain are involved, which bits are called upon. An unconscious bias, it's been identified, it's been observed, it's validated in brain studies using MRI technology. So unconscious bias is now acknowledged by psychologists and neuroscientists as real and measurable. In fact, I even have my unconscious bias measured, and I'll explain a little more about how you can do that too later on. So for those of you whose learning style is that you need all the background information, let me try and do a very brief overview of the kind of the cognitive system, the brain science that's going on here. And I've just put a title under the head there, Thinking Fast and Slow. This is a really user-friendly book if you're interested in knowing more about this, by Daniel Kahneman. So we effectively have two cognitive systems. Why don't you think of it as two different hard drives? You have a kind of fast hard drive and a slow hard drive. So fast, often called the automatic system, or Kahneman called it type 1 thinking, and a slow system, which is called the reflective system, or type 2 thinking. And let me illustrate it with this simple question. If I were to ask you what's 2 plus 2, you automatically know the answer, don't you? That's fast thinking. Actually, you didn't even need to think about it. If I ask you, what's 17 times 37? That's slow thinking, that's reflective thinking. That requires a lot more effort. It's not effortless, and you have to put a lot more concentrated effort into it. Now, the thing is, we need these two different types of systems, these two hard drives, because at any given moment, there's approximately 11 million pieces of information hitting our brains. And our conscious brains, as you can see there, it can process 60 bits of information, which means that more than 99% of our thinking is that fast, automatic thinking. And our behavior is dominated by that sort of subconscious system 1 thinking. In fact, it's that fast thinking that separates us from the animal kingdom. And it's one of the amazing things about humans, that humans, we can toggle back and forward between those two different types of thinking. So whilst it's very powerful, the downside of this unconscious thinking is that it's quite fallible. You see, we have this kind of dodgy data on our hard drives, on our fast thinking hard drive, because all through our lives we've been collating bits of information and worldviews of other important people in our lives, like our parents and so on, and they might be out of date with the circumstances that we find ourselves in today. I said that I had tested my bias. Let me show how you can do that as well. This is a website I'd really recommend visiting. It's called Project Implicit, and it's been going for a couple of decades now, almost. And this is from Harvard University and a few other universities. And they combined to create this system online where you could test whether or not you had any unconscious biases. And this is the screen you'll see when you go in. It says take a test, and you can choose all sorts of tests that will show whether you have an automatic preference for one group of people over another. So, black over white, young over old, thin people over fat people, religions, all sorts of things. Really helpful, because often we can have an implicit belief. So we can say, there's no way I'm racist, for example, and yet unconsciously we might often behave in a way that is. So this allows you to test those things. Now, as I mentioned earlier on, my brother Matt is gay, and not surprisingly then, I grew up not having any issue with homosexuality, and thought, well, I don't have any issue with this in the workplace. So when I got interested in diversity and inclusion, I came on the Project Implicit website, and the third up from the bottom there, you can see you can do with sexuality, gay versus straight or preference. And I was pretty disappointed, to be honest, when I found out, here's my results, I did a screen grab. In the green line there, it says your data suggests a moderate automatic preference for straight people compared to gay people. So not completely neutral, not slight, but moderate. Now, does this mean I'm a raving homophobe? Of course it doesn't. But what it does mean is that I need to be careful when I meet a new client or when I'm interviewing someone and I think there's a possibility they could be gay. I need to be sure that I'm not acting in a biased way towards them, and I'm not making snap decisions about them and all giving preference to someone who I believe might be straight. Now, being a bit put out by this, I thought I'm going to look into this a bit more. Like, why would I come out as a moderate preference when I would state matter of fact that I have no preference for straight over gay? And these are some of the things that are on my hard drive. They're some of the things that I've picked up over the years. You know, there's me in the middle there. And the first thing to say is that I live in a society where the majority of people are straight. So in the purple box there, you can see the stats from the Office of National Statistics. And in the last census, 1.6% of men identified as gay. Now, it's probably a lot more than that, but in terms of the census, that's what it said. There's me in the little blue dress, my twin sister in the pink dress. That's maybe that's why I've got an interest in diversity. I was always dressed in blue. But that's Matt sitting next to me. Now, my dad, who is above me there, he had a really big influence on my life. I was really close to my dad, and sadly he passed away in his 50s. He never knew that my brother Matt was gay. So that was kind of a sort of a secret, I suppose, or, you know, it wasn't the right time then for, so, but I'm sure that had an impact on me. And my dad used to howl with laughter on a Saturday night at open all hours. Do you remember Mr. Humphreys? I'm free. And that kind of stereotypical way that gay people used to be represented in the 80s, and probably actually are still today in the media. And then I also grew up going to a church where homosexuality would have been preached as a sin from the pulpit. So all these things were on my hard drive, and this helps me to understand why I might have this automatic preference. And I hope that illustrates to you why some of the things that might be going on in your head, why you might have some biases, and why really, you know, this isn't something to feel bad about, but it's certainly something to identify our biases, because it's really quite liberating once you know these things and you can start to counteract them. So I've just turned 40. I was born in 1975. That wasn't traumatic at all, but it did get me thinking about the huge societal changes that we've been through in the last 40 years. Just since I was born, I mean, actually, incidentally, it was the year that Microsoft brought out the first personal computer, and yet nowadays, you know, 40 years on, last year, you know, wearable tech, the way we communicate, it has just changed so phenomenally. We are an aging country. In 1975, the average age was 33, and now it's 40. There's been a really distinct change in the age that mums have their babies. So in 1975, 50% of all babies were born to mums under the age of 25. But by 2015, only 20% of babies were born to mums under the age of 25. So this has had a really significant change on our working environment, because what it means is that women are in the workplace a lot longer. They're getting a lot more senior in their organizations before they might be having a break for children or not having a break at all. And this is what the face of young people, British people, look like in this society now. It has completely changed. Ethnicity has changed, you know, beyond recognition just in 40 years. As has our views of disability. You know, it used to be a completely hidden thing. Let's just think about how positive, wasn't it great, the impact that the Paralympics had when it was hosted in London. Amazing, amazing change, I think, in attitudes. Of course, there's still a huge way to go, because 1 in 5 people in this country have got a disability. They have all the same aspirations work-wise as people without a disability, and yet they face a lot of obstacles. And finally, the last change I'd point out societally is that there has been a really significant change in our views to the LGBT community, because I think only 7 years before I was born, it was still, you could still be arrested for the Homosexual Act, whereas today the law, you know, totally protects people who identify as LGBT, and of course even marital rights, you know, changed in the last year, thank goodness. So that's fantastic. I suppose what I'm trying to stress is that sometimes the things on our hard drive are a bit out of date, and that's what's informing our opinions, which isn't always that helpful. So let's move on to talk about the most common unconscious bias that we see in the workplace. What do they look like in practice, and what can we do to mitigate their impact? Here's something really important to be aware of. Unconscious bias is displayed extremely subtly. It's not premeditated, and it kind of shows up in what I describe as micro behaviors or micro inequalities. So let me illustrate that to you. This horrible stock image, and let's just pretend this is a typical management meeting, and let's make an assumption that the older chap at the end of the table, that he's the manager, the team leader, and he would say, you know, I value all my team, I respect all of them. He would never say that he is biased against any of them. Maybe he thinks, oh, you know, students, they're such lazy people, and these graduates are coming on the graduate scheme, they've got it so easy. Let's assume the guy that's speaking, the younger one with his hand in the air, let's assume that he's one of those graduate trainees on the team. And maybe what happens, because unconscious bias is shown so subtly and in these micro behaviors, maybe when the young guy starts speaking, the team leader puts his pad down and his pen down. He crosses his arms. He closes his body language a bit more. Maybe he doesn't look at the guy speaking so often. See, he doesn't even know he's doing it. He's unconscious of it. But I bet the young graduate knows. I bet he feels a bit awkward every time he tries to contribute to the team meeting. And what is the organisation missing out on as a result of that? What about the others around the table? Maybe they can see it's happening too, and it makes them lose a little bit of respect for their leader. What's that doing to the team dynamics? The problem is we see unconscious bias as someone else's problem. We tend to see it as something that isn't an issue for us. And I would be the first to say I'm far too open-minded to fall into the unconscious bias trap. But as I tried to show, that type 1 thinking, that 99% of our thinking, it's automatic. It's not something, you know, that we necessarily consciously do. Let me take you through, there are about, dozens of unconscious bias, and of course we don't have time. I'd love to be able to go through this in a bit more, because actually this is the application stuff. This is where we can make changes in teams, and you know, please, I would love to come in and explore this with you in your organisation more. But let me just touch on a couple of the types of unconscious bias that most commonly we see in the workplace. And here's the first one. We call it affinity bias. It's also sometimes known as the mini-me bias or subjective choice bias. And I think this picture sums it up. Frankly, Dinsdale, we like the look of you. This is where you might see it. It certainly shows up in interviewing candidates or employees for organisational fit, as we often describe it. I think what we really mean is, do they fit me? Are they like me? We also see it with who we tend to network with. We tend to network with the people that we like. Just have a think about, who do you have coffee with? Who do you go to lunch with? Who do you say hello to and not say hello to as you walk through the office in the morning? What about giving some clients better service over others because you like that client? I know I have definitely done that. And what about who you select staff, what staff you select for projects, or who you give information or helpful developmental feedback? Do you give it to people who you know well, the people that you like, or do you give it to people that you don't really know because they're really not like you and you haven't really invested the time to get to know them? A second type of unconscious bias that we see a lot is something called confirmatory bias, excuse me, which is where we search and interpret and remember information in a way that confirms our perceptions, the pre-existing perceptions that we already had. And I'll give you two very specific examples of where we see this, just to help illustrate the point. So interviewing candidates, if you've got a candidate that comes from a more high-profile company, we tend to think that they're more qualified than other candidates from a lesser-known company, and the hiring decision may be swayed by that. Or what about in a performance review or appraisal? For example, if an employee was previously labelled as high potential, we tend to look for information that confirms that bias. And likewise, people who might have been labelled as poor performance. And that could have been, even in a different department, in a different role. That still has an impact on the way that we view those people. This bias results in a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy because we believe other people have potential or are great performers, and we treat them as such. You see, our mind is very powerful at materializing biased beliefs into reality. So what can we do about that? Well, certainly with confirmatory bias, seeing is believing. So providing facts and results, using matrix, those sort of things are much better ways to make decisions rather than just going on gut instinct. These are just a few of the other biases. There isn't time to go through, but just wanted to flag up a couple of others that you might want to look into. But let me give you some tips as inclusive leaders. And the first is this: you have got to know yourself to be able to lead yourself. I mean, have you ever thought, what's it like to be on the other side of me? It's definitely something worth considering. And if you don't know, maybe you need to find some way of asking the people that you lead. I love this quote by Sondra Thiedemann, who's a social anthropologist. She said, you've got to watch your thoughts and assumptions. It's a little bit like spying on your internal self. So I did a little bit of spying on my internal self. I went to see Take That, don't judge me, and couldn't get a hotel. I was looking at Airbnb and found myself looking more at the people than the actual room. Here's a close-up of them. Naturally drawn towards Elaine, who was the most like me, rather than Sonika, Stefano, and Alex. So here's a really practical tip. If you catch yourself using all, if you say, all Asians are good at maths, or all women are nurturing, or, whatever it is, when you start to categorize people and lump them all in together, that's definitely when the alarm bells are ringing that you might be being unconsciously biased. Another really good way of checking your bias is to consider something I'd call substitution. It's much easier for me to illustrate this than explain it to you. So what happens if you replace one group of people with another? For example, GQ, they have a Man of the Year competition, and there they are on the front cover, and then they decided to have a Woman of the Year, and hello, Lana Del Rey is naked. Now, bizarrely, this only looks really wrong when you do this, when you substitute one category of people for another. It's interesting, isn't it? Makes a really huge difference. So if you're organizing a client away day, or some sort of event for the department, would it work if you substituted the whole group of people for a group of women, or a group of Muslims? Would it still land? Would it still be appropriate? And the third thing is to reflect back, just like I did with Airbnb. You have to move towards your bias. That's one of the things we know for sure about how you reduce your bias. The things that you don't know about, the cultures, the religions, you need to move your bias move towards your bias to eliminate it. So, I needed to go and stay with Sonika to reduce my bias, because we know that the more commonalities we find, the less power our biases have to control our thoughts. And here's another great quote from Sheryl Sandberg. She said, the simple act of talking openly about behavioral patterns make the subconscious conscious. And there's a great example of how they did this, how they handled this in one situation in Google. See, Google had this, they used to have anyway, this situation where when promotional opportunities came up, you could be nominated by someone, or you could self-nominate, and it was done in rounds. And what they noticed was that they rarely got women self-nominating. There were a lot more men than women. And so the next time a promotion round came up, they just emailed all employees and said, just so you're aware, we tend to get a lot less women self-nominating than men. And the simple act of talking openly about behavioral patterns made the subconscious conscious. And so a lot more women then went on to apply. See, it's over to you, the inclusive leader. I honestly believe that diversity, it shouldn't stop with HR. In fact, I don't even think it should start there. I think the essence of inclusion should begin in each of us. I said I was going to give you one golden rule for inclusion, and it's this: be the change you want to see. And I'm not just stealing this line from Gandhi because it's a great sentiment. I mean this in a totally practical sense. Don't be the team leader who says he values work-life balance, but then sends emails at 11 p.m. and expects a reply. Don't be the leader that always plans meetings for 4:45, knowing that the parents are going to have to leave to go and pick up their children. I could cite many examples of organizations that have invested in diversity and inclusion, and yet they failed to be the change that they wanted to see. And that is why there is such a huge opportunity, if you are a leader of people, to be the change that you want to be. Because unlike exclusion, inclusion isn't something that just happens. It requires effort and it requires attention. And I believe you can be a champion of inclusivity. We need to look at people and value them for who they are, rather than what they're not when compared with ourselves. And I know it's unrealistic to expect that our unconscious biases, which have taken years to develop, will melt away in a 30-minute webinar. Of course they won't. But we can commit to try to be a champion of change, champion of inclusivity, and to get to know ourselves a bit better, to lead ourselves so that we can lead others to be more inclusive. Okay, let me come out of this screen and go back on so that I can see some of your questions. Hopefully there's been some questions. If you want to fire your question in, now would be a good time to do it, because we've got about 10 minutes left to finish this. Okay. Not getting, I'm just trying to make this work. Excuse me a second while I click around. Let me have a look down here. Okay. Can you give us, thank you, John, can you give us some practical ways to explain how you can challenge? Oh, I see. So how can you challenge someone who you know is being acting in a biased way? Absolutely. So it's really good to call out people when they're being biased, but you do have to do it sensitively. And I think it's a real sign of an inclusive leader if you're prepared to call someone out for biased behavior. I'll give you a great example of when this happened. One of the clients that we were working with, we did some unconscious bias workshops with them, and later on they were having a sales team meeting. All the men, all the people in the sales team were men. There was just one woman, and the team manager had asked one of the sales guys to lead the meeting. And at the start of the meeting, let's call him Dave, I don't know what he was called, the guy that was leading the meeting, he said, right, who's going to take notes? Joe, you take notes. And he automatically defaulted to the only woman in the team to take the notes. Now, you might not think there's anything wrong with that. And maybe it was completely, it wasn't, I'm sure he meant nothing by it. But at the end of it, the manager took Dave aside and said, isn't it interesting that you gave the pen to write on the whiteboard to the only woman in the team? And actually, she was the leading salesperson in the team. And so they discussed it a bit, and Dave said, well, all women have better handwriting. And there's that word, all. Of course, all women don't have better handwriting. If that's the case, then I am not a woman, because I can barely read my own writing. So, all women do not have better handwriting. And anyway, the more they discussed it, eventually Dave said, I think probably there was something of, I kind of, view women more secretarial role than men, and maybe it was a little bit biased. Both left totally happy with the situation, and actually really great inclusive leadership from that gentleman. So there's a really good example. But what I would say is it's better done in private than in front of lots of people generally. And I think humor works really well. In fact, I think humor always with diversity and inclusion is a really good approach, because it's very easy to come across as strident. And certainly as an organization where we do a lot of consultancy in this area, we found that storytelling, which is why I spent so long at the beginning just explaining unconscious bias in story terms, and humor are great approaches to this topic. Unfortunately, although it's a shame that it comes to this. Often really banging the drum and getting angry works less, in our opinion. So I think there is as much something about the medium as the message when it comes to diversity and inclusion. Okay, let's see. What other questions have we got coming in here? Okay, so someone said, what's benevolence bias? It was the top one on that slide of unconscious bias you didn't have time to go through. Okay, so benevolence bias is, well, that's usually described as bias wrapped up as kindness. And sometimes people be quite overt about, without realizing it, about benevolence bias. So have you ever found yourself saying to, actually comes up quite a lot in gender and maternity issues. So sometimes people say to returning mums or pregnant mums, you know, oh, I assume you're going to come back part-time. And they mean it in the kindest of ways. They don't mean it to be derogatory, but actually that can be, it's not really their place to say. Or let me give you some other examples. I've got a few written here actually, that we've had come up in all sorts of surveys we've done. Someone said, I didn't think this role would suit you as it required travel and dinners with clients, and I'm sure you would much rather be at home with your children. See, it's bias wrapped up as kindness. And we don't necessarily even overtly say this, but sometimes we just think these things. It's part of our thought process when it comes to who we're going to give projects to, who we're going to give overseas assignments to, that sort of thing. Okay, let's see. What else have we got coming up here? Oh, all my questions have disappeared. It's no good. Oh, I'm sorry to say that all the questions have gone and I don't seem to be able to get them back. I may have accidentally deleted all of them, and if I did, I'm sorry. If you asked a question, please tweet me and I will send a reply. I'm really sorry about that. So I'm gonna stop there, I think, because I can't see any more questions. I hope you found this really helpful. I'm sorry it's been such a whiz through this topic, but hopefully it did give you an introduction. We've talked a lot less about in organizational terms and a lot more in terms of what you personally can do about inclusion and diversity. But obviously there are huge organizational benefits that we know of that have been absolutely proven, financial return, teams being more effective and more innovative. It's stopping groupthink, so less risk of all the yes ma'am, yes sir responses. The more diversity you have, the more likely there is to be healthy challenge. We know that it leads to higher employee engagement, less turnover of staff. So there really is wonderful benefits to diversity and inclusion. And we are in turbulent times. If ever we needed there to be greater inclusion in our organisation, absolutely it's now. So thank you so much for joining me today and Raise the Bar. It's been an absolute pleasure to present this webinar, and I'm going to sign off. Bye now.